Hello and welcome to Ruby Rogues. I'm John Epperson, and we have a couple panelists today. We have Luke.
Hi.
Welcome. And we have Jonathan
Reinink.
Your thing cut off and gave me the dots right as I was looking at it, and I was like, oh my gosh, Reinink. Welcome. Jonathan is the author or creator, however you want to say that, of Inertia.js, and we just have him here today to yap about it. Can you just give us a little bit, just to start out, about your background and why you might be famous, and then we can go ahead and get into Inertia after that?
Yeah, for sure. I am a web developer, and I've been doing web development for almost 2 decades by now, and I hang out mostly in the Laravel community, so I contribute to that framework, and I kind of like doing all things PHP. And yeah, my main projects have been some libraries and some PHP libraries. I was also involved early on in the Tailwind CSS framework, if you're familiar with that. Me and my buddy Adam Wethen built that. And more recently, I have focused on Inertia as well as a bunch of database stuff. I'm a big fan of databases and optimizing databases and active record. And so I put out a course recently about that. So those are kind of the things I mostly work on. I work for myself outside of that. I run a small SaaS business, solo SaaS, and that's fun. That's pretty much me.
Leveling up is important. I spend at least an hour every day learning ways I can improve my business or take a break and listen to a good book. If you're looking to level up, I recommend you start out with the 12-week year as a system to plan out where you want to end up and how to get the results you want. You can get it free by going to audibletrial.com/code. That's audibletrial.com/code.
Awesome. So since we were planning to talk about Inertia, let's go ahead and dive in. What exactly is Inertia?
Yeah, so it's always fun when you come up with a new project that's a little bit different than other things. It's certainly been one of the most challenging things. It's just explaining what Inertia is. And kind of the simplest way to describe it is it's a way to build single-page applications without needing an API, meaning you can build a single-page app using a classic server-side framework such as Rails or Laravel, and you can use classic server-side routing, classic server-side controllers. But the only difference is with Inertia, there is no server-side views. All the views are done with Vue, or they're done in React, or done using Svelte. And what happens is you basically return some data from a controller, and where you'd normally return a view and output that data, you instead return a JavaScript page component. So just imagine a JavaScript page component being rendered on the page instead of like an ERB template, I guess is what they would be considered in Rails. And obviously that's client-side rendered, so it's not server-side rendered. But what happens is every single time you navigate from one page to the next, Inertia intercepts any page clicks so that you don't do full page reloads, but instead, when you click a link, Inertia will intercept that link click, and instead of doing a full page reload, it'll run off to the server, making what's called an Inertia request, and the server will pick it up, say, okay, this is an Inertia request, and it'll fire back the data needed for the next page. And the data is the JavaScript page component, be Vue or React or whatever, and the data, the props for that component. And then what happens is client side, so that's made as an AJAX request, that data comes back, that response comes back, and then dynamically client side, the page component is swapped out, and that's using dynamic components, which is a feature of all three of the popular client side frameworks, Vue, React, and Svelte. So it's dynamically swapped out, and it's given its new page props. And the big benefit there is, one, when you're navigating from one, so there's like 3 key benefits. One, you're navigating page to page, you're not doing full page reloads, so there's a performance benefit to that. 2, when it's doing that, because you're not doing a full page reload, it's not having to reboot Vue or React every single time. So it's like really like silky smooth kind of experience. It's just like it's like you're working with an SPA, except you're not. You're just navigating from one page to the next, and it's just swapping out those components, those page components dynamically. And 3, and I knew this was going to happen, I don't remember my third benefit, but the third one's the obvious one. You get to build an app using client-side technology. And really kind of what pushed me down this road is I was building more, like in my applications that I built, and I always use Laravel, which is very similar to Rails. So for this audience, just kind of think of them more or less as the same thing. I was, much of my apps were starting to contain more and more like rich UI and more client-side functionality, more JavaScript requirements to basically make the UIs work a certain way that just kind of wasn't possible using classic server-side rendering. And what I was basically doing is I was in my page responses, I was returning server-side render view, which would then have view components mixed into the page. So what would happen is the response would come back from the server, then Vue would kick into gear, and any of the Vue components on the page, there'd be like a little flicker, and then they would show up, right? And then you'd have those individual components would be reactive and whatnot, right? And so but that kind of comes with a whole bunch of interesting problems. I mentioned the flicker and just kind of having to manage each one of those separate components. So by going this way with Inertia, you're really like fully committing to client-side rendered views. So you give up server-side rendered views. That is a trade-off. But what that means is anytime you're working with any of the templates within your application, you have the power of JavaScript, you have the power of Vue or React, and you can do whatever you need to do. And it's just a really, really nice way of working. Yeah, so that's kind of a longer description. I would say that like I definitely built it for people who have traditionally worked with server-side rendered applications, like frameworks like, again, Laravel, Ruby, Django, that kind of stuff. People who are familiar with creating controllers and getting data from the database and then passing that data to a view. The whole paradigm is very, very similar and much different than the classic, the more standard SPA approach where you have some separate API, some separate app that provides like a REST API or GraphQL API. So it's definitely targeted at that audience. And kind of as I've said to people before, I kind of joke that Inertia is like the gateway drug to creating single page applications, because if you're coming from a monolith background, Inertia just makes it so easy to get up and running with creating like what essentially feels exactly like a client side single page app, but kind of using the technology that you know and love already.
Yeah, I actually find it super interesting. I mean, I've been for at least the past day or so kind of checking out some of the stuff on the site and things like this. And there's a lot of so it kind of sounds, just to make sure that I understand this the way that I think that I understand this, you're more or less going to, obviously being familiar with Rails here, you're going to create like this kind of high level sort of meta layout, as you will, or whatever. And then instead of creating a whole bunch of views for all of my pages, I'm just returning this Inertia thing, which has a props attribute or whatever. And then I'm just basically returning data as JSON. So kind of a bit like an inline API kind of thing almost. Like I'm just kind of rendering JSON almost there. And that's more or less how my page is going to run. And that's how my backend's going to run. And then I basically just have a single page app on the page. That's it.
Yeah.
And all these props get passed down and I just do with it what I want to in that single page app.
Yep.
It's kind of
so a couple
an interface, as you will, if you will.
Yes, so a couple of things to be aware of. Like I like to compare Inertia in a lot of ways to almost React Router or Vue Router, because in a way, all Inertia is a specialized router, like client-side router that lives between your server and your controllers, which is returning data as JSON, and your client-side page components. So it's the piece that connects the two. But unlike with a classic app, with Vue Router, React Router, whatever, you don't have any client-side state management at all. So you're not using any client side like Vuex or whatever the React equivalents are. You're not using any of that stuff because all your data and all your state is essentially at the server. So it's not like you're making requests to the API client side, saving that in your client side Vuex library or database or whatever you want to call it, and then rendering components based on that. Basically, every single time you visit a page, the data is coming straight from your controller and going to your client-side page component.
All right, I got a dumb question. You're going to have a few of those from me. So I wanted to kind of have a go at this, and I've been building this Vue app. And the way I populate my Vue, is it Vue or Vue?
Vue.
It's the accent, isn't it? I can't even tell. I think I'm trying to make it English. The way I populate my component is I go off my ERB template downloads, and then I do a get to get the initial data from the page, and then it drops in when the get returns. You've got your Vue building. Now, in the examples on the Inertia.js site, then it uses Laravel, and we could take a nice divergence here because I'm starting to get Laravel envy. Some of the tooling that you show off on the Inertia.js website, I don't think the Ruby or Rails community have. I'm sure John know more, but there's a plugin where you can see the database queries being done on that page, like the SQL. And I saw that, it would have been useful. I mean, for years, if I could just see what the page was hitting, does that exist for Rails?
I'm pretty sure I've seen various things, and you can definitely see it in your logs.
I know, I can see it in my logs. But to have it there,
Hang on. I mean, maybe I could go find this. I don't know if it's a good use of my time, but maybe I could go find this. But I'm pretty sure that I've seen something somewhere that does something like that. However, regardless, you do know that you can switch those Laravel things to Rails to see the Rails examples on the Inertia site.
No, I didn't actually. No, I didn't find a tab. Where's the tab? There's a
so
tab?
every code snippet there is on the site, it defaults to Laravel, but you can switch it over to Rails.
Oh no, there's some basic fail going on here.
No way.
Oh,
so what you're saying is you're very appreciative of how awesome Laravel is on a Ruby podcast. All right.
I'll be honest, this is not the first time this has happened.
That's a nice workflow. I like the tool. Yeah, I can't find this thing you're talking about. I don't believe it exists.
I'm looking at it right now. I'll take a screenshot.
Yeah. So the tool in Laravel in the PHP community, it's called the PHP debug bar, and there's a Laravel debug bar version built on top of that, and it's fantastic because it's exactly you can figure out all your database queries and your logs and whatnot. But what the Laravel debug bar does is it just puts them right in the bottom of your screen, just like it's almost like a Chrome console, right, where it shows you exactly what database queries you're making and what models you're loading from the database and how much memory you're using. It's super, super helpful. Helps you to identify N+1 issues and slow queries and stuff.
Where's my Rails debug bar? That's what I want to know. Moving swiftly on from my basic inability to use a website. So I was asking about the way you book it in. What does, for the benefit of people who can't use a website like me, how does Rails send down that lump, because there's two things, aren't there? There's the kind of layout and there's the props. Yes.
Yeah. So I'll walk you through. I often fail to kind of explain this just because you forget sometimes kind of where to start after you've talked about something for long enough. But so what essentially happens, and I'll explain it as best I can, kind of using Rails lingo, but I'm not super familiar with it all, but work with me. So basically a request is going to come in. So for the very first time that someone hits your Inertia application, your Inertia Rails application, what's going to happen is it's going to notice that it's a standard full page visit, right? And what it's going to do is it's going to hit Rails and it's going to see that it's not an Inertia request. So it's not going to return some JSON. It's just going to go through the normal flow. And what it's going to do is it's going to return your base ERB template. So your layout file, right? And that layout file, it's just like a standard layout file that has your head, which is going to have your script tags, and it's going to have your style tags, kind of just your standard layout. The difference is what it's not going to do is it's not going to, and keep in mind that someone may land on your app on any different page. It doesn't have to be the home page, of course, the index page. It could be any page in your application, right? So it's going to see that request coming in. So it's going to return, or it's going to server-side render that layout, except the only difference is within the body of that server-side rendered HTML file, it's not going to have any page content. So the page content will not exist. So if you landed on, say, the users page within your application, it's not going to have a bunch of HTML, server-side HTML generated and rendered. What it's going to do instead is there is a base div that you need to put in your base layout. And that's the div that your client-side application is going to mount to. So what happens is that base div, your client-side app, Vue, React, whatever, mounts to that. But what happens is server-side, it passes this page object, so a JSON encoded page object, as one of the attributes within that div. So I think it's called data-page is the page attribute. I should probably double check and know that offhand, but I'm pretty certain. Yeah, it's a data-page. That's the attribute on the div. So imagine a div has an ID of app, which is what your Vue or React app's going to mount into. And then it has an attribute called data-page. And the contents of that data-page attribute is just a string, but it's actually a JSON encoded string. And what it's including is all the necessary information that Inertia needs in order to boot up that particular client-side page component. So it's going to include two main things. That the most important things to know are, one, the component name. So the component name is going to be the Vue or React component, page component name. So in this case, it might be the user page, which is going to have a corresponding userpage.vue file or userpage.react file. And then the second piece of information that's going to be in that JSON payload is the props, which is the data. I call them props because they're considered, when you're working with Vue or React, props are the properties, they're the attributes, they're the data that gets passed to that component. component. So it's essentially the data. So if you imagine now, if we hit the Rails app, it's the user's page, which causes the routing to go to the user's controller, the index method of the user's controller. Your index method's going to go off and it's going to use active record to get some data from the database for the users that you want to display on that page. And then in a classic Rails app, and jump in if I get any of the terms wrong here, gents, because I'm going to use more kind of the lingo that I know. But what it's going to do is normally you would then return an ERB template that you pass the user index view to, and pass the data, which is the users you just looked up from the database using active record. And that's going to go off and generate your HTML. In this situation, you would instead return an inertia response. So but the clever thing about the inertia response is, so it's basically the exact same thing. You basically return inertia, you pass it the name of the page component, and you pass it the data. So the controller itself doesn't know if it was a full page visit, like a standard GET visit, or if it was an actual inertia visit. Inertia takes care of that. All the controller has to do is return the page component name, so the client-side page component name, and the data for that component. Then Inertia, behind the scenes, it inspects the request and says, okay, was this a full page visit? So where we need to display the layout. Well, if that's the case, well, then we're going to display the layout. We're going to render it server side, and we're going to inject that base div with the ID of app and with the data page attribute with all the data for it. And then we're just going to render that out as kind of just a standard HTML page. Then Inertia will grab that data and boot up the client-side application. However, on subsequent visits, when Inertia, so if you go then and click to a different page, maybe you click on one of the users, you want to view the user. What Inertia does is it intercepts that click, that page visit, and it then makes the XHR request to the server. It's going to hit in the exact same way. Now imagine it's going to hit your user's controller again, but this time it's going to hit the show method. So again, what would you do just in a standard Laravel or Rails app is you would go off, you'd get that user from the database using active record, right? And then you would normally just return a response to show the user show page with the user data. Except again, with Inertia, you wouldn't do that. You'd return an Inertia response that would then have the user show page component, client-side page component, and the data, which would be the user data, maybe their ID and their first name, their email, and their last name, and whatever else, right? So when that request comes through, the XHR request, what Inertia does is it passes through an X Inertia header, which is set to true, so that your Rails app knows that this isn't a full page reload. This is like an Inertia request, so it's an XHR request. And what it does instead is it returns not the full body and the full layout and everything else. It just returns the JSON data that it requires. So that's the same JSON data that would be put in the data page attribute if it was like the full HTML layout render kind of on the first visit, except it just returns the JSON and nothing else. And it returns that obviously as a JSON response, which that's going to have your component name and all your props. And then kind of getting back to what I explained earlier, Inertia is going to then take that. It's going to dynamically swap out the client-side page component with the new page component and dynamically swap out the data, the props for that component, and like for the user in the browser, it's going to look like you went to a whole new page, but the reality is it's just done some really nice magical work in the background to just kind of flip it for you. And then of course, like I said, Inertia is essentially, in its simplest form, it is a client-side routing library. So it's going to update your URL in the browser, and it's going to update the necessary page state so that you have proper history and stuff, so you can navigate back and forth and stuff like that. So that's kind of like the trickiness that we do. But the reality is, from a development experience for people who are using Rails or Laravel, who are kind of used to working with that, hey, I got a controller method, I got to get some data from the database, and then I got to return a view with some data. It literally feels the exact same way, except the difference is you're working with Vue or React templates. You're not working with ERB templates.
All right, I found it now. It's super easy. And for the other kind of web challenge people who are listening, there is a gem. There is this is the key component I was missing. There is a Inertia_Rails gem that does it for you.
Yes, I should have mentioned that probably too. Yes, so you don't got to do any of this work. This, like I said, when Inertia does all the magical work for you, it's actually, and when I say magical, it's really not it's not magical at all. It's in its most basic form. It's, imagine this: you have a page response. The Inertia gem looks to see, hey, was the X Inertia header set to true? Well, yeah. If it is, then return JSON instead of HTML. It's like literally that basic. And there is, some other interesting features that kind of go along with it, such as automatic asset refreshing and partial reload. So it does get more complicated, but in its basic form, like I tell people that if you didn't have the gem, so we do have an official Inertia gem for Rails, and we also have an official Laravel package for this as well. So it kind of just makes it really, really easy. But there's all kinds of people who are making adapters, client-side adapters for other languages and frameworks. And it's in its most basic form, it really does not take that much. We actually have a page that kind of explains the spec. I kind of call it a protocol because in a way that's really what it is. And as long as you implement that protocol, which is a very simple protocol, you can do this in other languages. I tell people, I've literally seen this done. Somebody reached out and they had done this in Cold Fusion. I didn't even know Cold Fusion was still a thing, but somebody has created an Inertia Cold Fusion adapter. And I know there's been one created for Django and all kinds of other frameworks now. The challenge for me as a library maintainer is normally in the past, anytime I've created libraries, I've always worked with the language that I'm familiar with. So I've worked with PHP and Laravel, and it's not been that, or even JavaScript, and it's not been that hard maintaining the library. The challenge with Inertia is I'm finding myself becoming more proficient in other languages and frameworks because in order to maintain the Rails adapter, I got to now be more of a Ruby expert. I'm anything but an expert. I shouldn't even said that, but I got to know the basics of those frameworks. But fortunately, I've had a lot of people kind of jump in and help out on framework specific adapters. Really, my job at the end of the day is managing the client side adapters because that's really the hard part. The Vue, the React, and the Svelte adapters are the tricky kind of piece because they kind of got little differences. The way they do dynamic component swapping, the way they do data handling, the way they do reactivity, all that stuff is a little bit different, each one of those client-side frameworks. So that's kind of really the heart of my job. And even there, I actually have somebody who's helped on the project. One guy who's managing so I manage the Vue adapter, another guy manages the React adapter, and another guy manages the Svelte adapter. So it's really quite a collaborative project in that sense.
All right. Now that we theoretically know how to make an app with Inertia, why am I making an app with Inertia? Where do you see Inertia kind of fitting into this space? And what kinds of apps are we using it for? Things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good question to ask because I think it's important. I think sometimes what happens is people come out with new projects. And I think people like the idea of saying, well, this, whatever this new piece of technology is, this is now the one way to do all the things. And we just we want to double down and fully commit to that for everything. And if it doesn't do everything, well, then we don't like it. Yeah, we get disappointed if it isn't appropriate for all use cases. And I'm generally slow to say use the right tool for the job because I find quite often we're just most effective using the tool we know. And that tends to be what's worked out better for me. I know I know that Elixir might be better or Node might be better for creating certain apps nowadays, but I'm just so stinking fast with Laravel that I use that because it's a tool I know and love. But I will say that kind of in response to that question, I do think that Inertia is super well suited for some situations and not others. So the one that it's not well suited for is in a situation where it actually does make sense to make a full-on API. So if it makes sense for you to have a full REST API and a full GraphQL API, then Inertia is maybe not the right choice. Because with Inertia, the whole, my goal with this is to avoid you having to create this whole separate project, this whole separate API, figuring out all the authentication, figuring out all the OAuth stuff and all that hoopla and the separate hosting account and everything else. My goal is that I just want to build an app. I want to get some data from the database, use an active record, and I want to spit that to a view and render it. That's what I want to do with Inertia. It's the very fast, classic monolith way of building an application. But if you did have a use case that you really, truly did need an API, so maybe you're building a web app that has an iOS app and an Android app, and maybe you have native desktop applications or whatever. If you have that use case, then Inertia may not be the right choice because it might just make sense in that situation to actually just go off and build that whole API. But in my experience, there's a ton of applications that get built, and I would say especially a lot of just business level applications that never ever ever go past being a web app. That's what they always are. So yeah, is there a chance that it could eventually need an API? Sure. But so often you don't need that. And you know what? You think about any application that's built with just classic Laravel and built with just classic Rails using classic Rails server-side rendering or Laravel server-side rendering, you've already made that decision. You've already said this is a web app. And if I ever need an API, well, then I'm going to go off and build a separate API for it. So that's really where Inertia fits. If you were planning and building a server-side rendered application, you've already said no to the API. So my thing here is I really wanted Inertia to be for those developers, those who said, I want to build a server-side application. I was going to build it with Laravel, or I was going to build it with Rails, using the standard monolith approach. I've already decided I'm not going to build an API. Well, then Inertia is a wonderful fit, because then it allows you to build a rich client-side application using Vue or React, while still completely working within the paradigm, the monolith approach that and you can be really, really, really fast with that approach. And in my experience as well, I have built applications that use Inertia as kind of the web app tool. And even in those applications, I've had like my own application. I do have an iOS and Android app that I'm building right now, but the iOS and Android app is so simple compared to the web app, because that's what makes sense for my business, that I still went in my Laravel app and I just built a really light REST API for my native iOS and Android apps. I still didn't need to fully double down and make my whole web app, run on this API. It still made sense to build a web app using React or Vue and Inertia without an API. And then literally I have like 5 API endpoints for this core functionality that I'm making available natively to iOS and Android. So I hope that kind of explains it. So that's really, I would say the reality is there are probably a ton of situations. Basically, anytime you are planning on building just a classic Rails application, that's a good use case for an Inertia app. If you have any sort of more interesting client-side needs, and by that, and this is maybe the last distinction I should make, I wouldn't personally use Inertia for anything that needs to be public-facing. And the reason why is Inertia is still a client-side rendered application, meaning it doesn't work great from an SEO perspective. Yes, Google is getting better at indexing Vue and React apps, JavaScript apps. It is, and it probably only will continue to get better. But I think if I was building an application, if I was building a blog, or if I was building a news site, or I was building anything that had a public face where SEO, search engine optimization, was a concern, I probably wouldn't use Inertia because of that limitation. Really, I designed Inertia for, admin control panels, applications, SaaS applications where you need to log in, all those kind of tools. And one great use case is, I've done this as well, is you could absolutely say build a Rails application that's completely server-side rendered for your public-facing pages, be it maybe you're building a SaaS app, you have a bunch of documentation that you want to make sure it's SEO friendly, you have your pricing page and your about page and all those feature pages. You could build all that stuff using Rails with classic server-side rendering, while still having the application in the background for the actual SaaS application be an Inertia application, but that's only available after you log in. And that's a really common combo where you use server-side rendering on the front end, and you use Inertia and client-side rendering on the back end.
Can we talk about the flicker?
Yes. So the simple answer is there is no flicker. No flicker at all. That's why it's so wonderful. So there was a flicker building it the old way. So the old way I do this is anytime I needed a Vue component or a React component in my application, I would be using classic server-side rendering in Laravel, which would return my full document, which would have all the page content, but somewhere in the page. So imagine it's maybe like a create user page, and maybe I want to create the form to create the user. Maybe I wanted to build that in Vue because I like the reactivity of it. I like to be able to handle errors and everything else, just kind of using that Vue approach, right? So maybe I'd have the whole page load, except the form itself would just be a Vue component that would boot up after the page loaded, right? And that's what I mean by a flicker. That little thing takes a second to boot up because Vue has to boot up. And it's minor, like we're talking milliseconds, but our eyes can perceive it. And we especially notice it when that component takes no space at first, but then it renders and it takes a bunch of space and kind of like causes the page to become longer, and you know things move around. And if you have a lot of Vue components, maybe you have a drop down component or a modal or different things like this, that problem just becomes worse and worse. Where with Inertia, that totally goes away because you're getting exactly what you'd have with like a classic Vue or a Vue or React app, where when you go to visit another page, it's going to just render that new Vue component and nothing's getting destroyed in between because you're not doing a full page reload. Vue and React are long living. So when I go to the next page, it's going to load that file in the background. It's going to load the data in the background via that XHR request. And then when it's ready, it's going to swap it out. And you can, there's ways to have loading graphics and stuff for in between that. But the point is nothing's being destroyed when you go from one page to the next that's causing any sort of flicker. It's really smooth.
So you sound like you care a lot about kind of responsivity and user experience, yes?
Very much so.
Let's talk milliseconds here. Let's talk some real numbers, because I can we could put enormous effort into kind of making this to help people improve the experience of their users. Let's face it, the whole point is to make the site nicer for the people we write the software for. So what looks like a good load page for you?
Yeah, so my goal generally on a regular web app is 200 milliseconds or less. If I'm building a new application, that's really what I'm going for. Now, that's what I would consider like a typical server response. But as you know, there's more that goes into a website loading than just your server response. You also have your client side, the time that it needs to render there, the time that it needs to actually paint it on the page, the time that it needs to download any JavaScript bundles and different things like that. So yeah, for me, this is one of the reasons why I like this approach so much, is because I've been very frustrated in the past building REST APIs or even GraphQL. Now, GraphQL is amazing, but you can run into performance issues really easy with GraphQL if you're not careful. You can run into N+1 issues just depending on the sort of graph of data you're returning. It can be tricky from a performance perspective in real applications to have every response from your API be really quick. And that's because these APIs, especially a REST API, is generic. It's generic because it needs to work for multiple different, any application that wants to consume that API. The wonderful thing about Rails and the wonderful thing about Laravel is that every single controller method, you are going to get the data exactly as you need it for that page. There's no generalized API there. It's like, okay, I'm displaying the users page. I want to go to the database and I want to get these 10 users, if it's paginated, for example, and I want to get their name and I want to get their ID and I want to get their email address and maybe I want to eager load their company along with it. So what Inertia, and this isn't really an Inertia feature, this is really just a Rails. This is like a monolith feature. It's like when each endpoint is only responsible for getting the data that it needs for the page that it's going to display, you can highly, highly optimize the data retrieval for those endpoints for exactly what's needed in that application. So that's one of the reasons why I really just like monolith apps in general, because I feel like that approach just leads to fast applications. And I've talked, I mentioned earlier that I love databases and I love learning how to, kind of make the most of the database, create proper indexes and return the minimal amount of data and run the fastest queries possible. That's stuff that I'm super interested in and focus on. So roundabout way of answering your question, I like 200 milliseconds or less from a response time from the server, which would be the Inertia response. But then there's also this whole client-side performance side of things. So let me talk briefly about that as well, because that is absolutely a trade-off you get when you build a client-side application. So one of the trade-offs we've talked about already is the SEO trade-off. If SEO is important to you, probably not going to make sense to build a fully client-side rendered application unless you have some sort of server-side rendering in place. And there's all kinds of fancy tools nowadays even to do that with JavaScript stuff. But you know what I'm saying? If SEO is important to you, you're not going to want to have client-side rendering as your primary way. So the other trade-off is that you now need to send all your client-side views, so all your page components, all your view components or your React components or your Svelte components, they all need to now be sent over the wire as JavaScript bundles to the client, right? So Inertia, what it does, and this is kind of like a really just, I think a cool feature, is it will automatically, you can use, because it is just really a plain old regular Vue or React app, it supports code splitting. So if you use code splitting, what happens is you land on the very first page. So maybe, going back to our example from earlier, let's say you hit for the very first page, the user index page. What is going to happen in an Inertia app is it's going to go and get only the minimal amount of JavaScript that's required to display that page. So it's going to get typically kind of like your core bundle, which is going to have like Vue or React and maybe some like core dependencies that are used kind of by the, all pages on the site. So it's going to grab that core bundle, which is small because it doesn't have all the pages through your whole application. It's just the core bundle. And then it's going to load whatever components are required for that page. So it could be if it's the user index page, it's going to go off and get the user index JavaScript bundle and download that. And then once it's downloaded, you never have to download it again because it's cached, right? The browser knows to not go off and download it again. So what that practically means is you hit an Inertia endpoint, it's going to only get the minimal amount of JavaScript that you need to actually display that page. And it's going to get the minimal amount of data from the server because that's the way a Rails app works. And the page can loads extremely quick. So I actually have a demo app if you want to try it out. It's called the demo app's called Ping CRM, which is available on the Inertia.js website. And you can actually, click around this application and see exactly what the performance is like. And I think it's hosted on Heroku, and I do that intentionally because anytime you host on Heroku, there's even a performance cost in saying having a one-off Linode or DigitalOcean server because the database is the Postgres database, which is not hosted on the same site as the actual web dyno. So there's always a performance cost that comes with that, which often, of course, makes sense if you want to have multiple web dynos and whatnot. So I've hosted it that way because I feel like that's a good representation of a real life application. And most responses from the server come back in about 100 milliseconds. And I think, that's a pretty awesome experience.
I've tried it. It is disgustingly quick.
That's what I want to hear.
For me, in the UK, it comes back in well under 100, to the extent that I'm quite suspicious that you're loading the next page in the background without telling me first, or doing some kind of dirty trick like that. Is it
and it's funny that you mentioned
database?
100%. Absolutely it is. Yep. Absolutely it is hitting the database. And that's interesting you mentioned that because it is a JavaScript application, there is really some cool opportunities to even do stuff like that. So if you hover over a link for more than a certain period of time, go off and eager load that data. And even if you don't want to eager load the data, what we can do is eager load the next JavaScript page component that link would require. So even if you are using code splitting, we can be smart about eager loading that next page component that you may want to click to. So yeah, that's a kind of the neat thing, because it is ultimately a real Vue or ultimately a real React app. You kind of get some of the cool things that you can do with those pieces of technology as well. I've been working on another feature that even allows you to do kind of like placeholder pages. So if you were to click on if you were on the user index page and you were to click on the user, like a show user page, I've got a working prototype where it could show kind of like a shell of the show user page while Inertia is still in the background grabbing that data, just again using a classic Rails controller show endpoint, and then swap it out when it has the data ready. And these are like those. It's not necessarily something. So the Inertia, so the Ping CRM demo doesn't do any of that. But I just think it's neat that if you had an application that you were that concerned about the user experience and you just really wanted to show something right off the bat when someone clicked a link to view a new page, that Inertia will allow you to do that. It technically doesn't allow you to do that yet, but that's something I'm working on.
Have you ever wondered if you could be offering a faster, less buggy experience for your customers? I mean, let's face it, the only way you're going to know that is by actually running it on production. So go figure it out, right? You run it on production, but you need something plugged in so that you can find out where those issues are, where it's slowing down, where it's having bugs. You need something like that there. And Raygun is awesome at this. They just added the performance monitoring, which is really slick, and it works like a breeze. I love it. I love it. It's like you get the ray gun and you zap the bugs. Anyway, definitely go check it out. It's going to save you a ton of time, a ton of money, a ton of sanity. I mean, let's face it. Grepping through logs is no fun. And having people not able to tell you that it's too slow because they got sidetracked into Twitter is also not fun. So go check out Raygun. They are definitely going to help you out. There are thousands of customer-centric, customer-focused software companies who use Raygun every day to deliver great experiences for their customers. And if you go to Raygun and you use our link, you can get a 14-day free trial. So you can go check that out at rubyrogues.com/Raygun.
Yeah, I certainly like speed, but I certainly don't get as excited necessarily as other people do about speed. But I know that a lot of people do care about it. I think the thing that's most interesting here is, so I know that it might be heresy, but I for a long time have more or less said that to me, the controller in MVC, right, really is an API provider, and you're just consuming that API with your view.
Yep.
And that's sort of like the typical way that people use it. And so I think that Inertia just kind of leverages that. In my mind, you're just leveraging that and making it really easy for people who are just used to using views to just be like, not have to think about it. Yeah, it's an awesome evolution in my opinion.
Yeah, I love that comment. That comment that it's just essentially an API. It is. The difference is with a Rails or Laravel app, you've accepted that there is this type coupling between this back-end controller and the front-end view. That's just an accepted,
absolutely.
Know. And, some people would say, well, that coupling's bad because now I can't use this endpoint for other things. And I say, no, actually, that coupling's awesome because one, it makes it really fast. You can create these applications really quickly, and you can optimize them from a performance perspective because you're only worrying about this one request. You're not worrying about 30 possible different permutations. It's just one request that you're concerned about.
Absolutely. Really, the only benefit to thinking about it that way is when you're suddenly ready to break the rules, right? So yeah, awesome. Anything else that we should know about Inertia that you're just like, I haven't talked about this, you guys should be thinking about this?
Yeah. So yes, there's maybe a couple different things that I think Inertia does really well and stuff that I'm even been improving on is one is scroll management. So what happens by default when you browse from one page to the next, just using like standard, normal, plain old website, and you scroll down and you visit the next page, and then you scroll down and you visit the next page, whatever, and then you hit back in the browser. The browser is smart enough to remember exactly where you were on each one of those pages, and that helps maintain context, right? Which is a really nice thing. Inertia allows you to do that because that basically is for free out of the box if you just do a standard page. But where it becomes tricky, and this is becoming more and more common, is people have essentially what are considered like scroll areas within your UI. So one really common use case for this is imagine you have kind of like your standard layout, left-hand side is your navigation, and the right-hand side is your content. And maybe along the top you have a bar, right? When you scroll the content, you maybe want to scroll the content, but not have your left-hand nav change. Or maybe even the other way around. Maybe when you scroll the content, you want your left-hand nav to follow with you or whatever, right? So you do this using scroll areas, overflow auto and stuff with CSS to kind of allow that sort of functionality. And yeah, so that's a very common thing with like modern applications, especially I would say more application style websites. So that kind of like goes out the window. What goes out the window when you're using scroll areas like that is scroll position management. So if you were to do that and you would go to visit the next page and you go back, the browser has no idea that you were scrolled in this container down 300 pixels. It's like, don't care, not my problem. All it cares about is restoring the body scroll position. So Inertia, we have support for basically automatic scroll restoration of containers as well. And you don't have to, that doesn't happen to all containers. You can actually define on a per container basis, like Inertia track the scroll position for this. And that's like a really, really nice feature that you basically, so that's one thing. Another thing that Inertia does really well is asset versioning. So this is a problem that a lot of people run into with modern client-side rendered applications is imagine you have a user, right? And they go to your application, they go to your website, and they click through a few different pages. And while they click, maybe they're on the user's page and then they're on the user show page. And right at that moment, you had to fix a bug or do something in that template and you redeployed it. So you redeployed those assets to the server. The problem is right now is with a typical client-side rendered application is if you now go back to visit that user index page, because it's not doing a full page reload, there's no way for the browser to know that maybe that user index page template changed. So they're going to see the old page template, which might be fine, or it might not, because you might be expecting data back from the server that's now out of sync with your template. You remember that type coupling that we're talking about between these two things. And would be no different if you were working with an API. If there's an expectation for the data to be there and it's not, and that old template could now generate an error, the application crash simply because you deployed an update to the application. And this is something that Rails and Laravel developers never have to worry about if you're using server-side rendered views, because when you go to the new page, it's doing a full page reload, you're getting a full page, all the new assets, everything else. So what Inertia does is we have there are ways to solve this with client side, like classic Vue or React apps, but it's complicated and people use service workers, and I'm not going to get into the details of how that gets solved, but it's kind of complicated. Whereas with Inertia, what's really cool about Inertia is that the front end and the back end are coupled together. So that's like, this coupling that we keep talking about, like that's the real benefit, because we can now let the server and the client side frameworks, and essentially what it is it's a server side Inertia adapter working with a client side Inertia adapter, and they're working together to make sure that things are working properly. So what happens is every single time you make an Inertia visit, we keep track of, let me back up before I even go there. It might be easier if I explain it this way. When you define your Inertia setup in Rails, you have the option on every single page, does Rails have this concept of like some sort of like base, like application service provider where you do kind of like default work? Could it like happen in like a middleware, or just like kind of like something that gets run on every single page request? I'm
we do have Rails middleware.
Right. So imagine, I forget exactly how the gents who put together the Inertia Rails adapter did this, but just imagine that somewhere in your Inertia configuration, in your Rails application, you basically say, this is the version of my assets. Your assets being your JavaScript, basically. Could also be your CSS.
Yep. Rails does handle that. Yep.
Yeah. So you have some sort of version number that indicates the current version of your assets. Like the way I do it in Laravel is I literally just get an MD5 of the assets, and if it changes, it changes. So what you do is you say Inertia version, and you pass it the current version. And that happens on every single request. So what happens then is that version gets passed to the client side. So that's one. So I've talked about this page object that gets passed around, which includes the component name and the props. Well, another property in that page object is the asset version. So the client side, Inertia always knows what the current version of your assets are. So then when you now click from one page to the next, so you're on the user show page and you want to go to the user index page, well, you click the user index page, Inertia goes off and it makes the XHR request, the Inertia request to your server to get the index page and the data for the index page. Inertia automatically passes what it believes is a current version to Rails. Then the Rails Inertia adapter says, okay, I got this request coming in. It's saying that the current asset version is 1.2.3, but we can see now that it's a new deploy has happened and the new asset version is actually 4.5.6. And what Inertia does is it actually stops the request at that point, and it then returns a it returns. So imagine this: an XHR request gets an immediate 409 conflict response back from Rails, and then what happens is Inertia gets that 409 conflict response back, and it says, "Oh, assets are out of date." So what Inertia then does is it automatically does not an XHR request to that page. So going from the user show page to the user index page, it's going to say the assets are out of date because the server just told me that. And it cuts that XHR Inertia request short, and it now does an automatic full page visit to the user index page. And then because you're doing a full page visit, you have the opportunity to use cache busting to reload your assets, and you're right back in business. So for the end user, it does mean that they'll have to re-download those assets, of course, but that's what you want because otherwise you wouldn't have deployed them. So they can continue browsing your Inertia app like a classic SPA until the assets are out of date, and then they're going to be forced they won't even notice really that it's happening, other than that request will reload the whole page and it'll look like a full page visit, and you're going to be right back in business on the page. And we do some smart things about the way we make that request, do that 409 response, and we automatically reflash data. So if you had any flash data that was going to be used, it automatically reflashes that. So even though you're doing a full page reload, you're going to still get that flash data come available. So that's a really, really, really cool feature of Inertia that is I think it would be harder to do with a classic SPA, but because of the way that the client side and server side adapters work together, it basically takes all the work out of asset refreshing and asset versioning. You literally, all you have to do is tell server side, tell Inertia what the current version of the assets are, and you're done, and it handles it. Which is also really nice from a development perspective, because if you're developing, you're constantly changing your files, and Inertia, you don't have to constantly hit refresh. You can just click a link and it'll just update automatically for you.
No, I agree. That is super cool. I mean, to be frank, I've been used to Rails handling asset management to me for so long that it is frustrating every time that I have to deal with it, because at this point in my development career, I just think that I shouldn't have to deal with it because
I know, exactly.
I literally cannot. I mean, shoot, we didn't even have that problem in Rails 1 because we weren't serving assets on the project that I was working on. So,
yeah.
It was so long ago.
Yeah, and there's some really the last thing I want to just mention about Inertia that we kind of didn't talk about yet, and is the fact that Inertia visits are not limited to GET requests. So you can make Inertia visits for post requests, put requests, patch requests, and deletes as well. And this is really cool. And it's kind of a complex thing to explain maybe on a podcast, but what it does is it makes forms a lot more like classic Rails form submissions, except it's all done via XHR, and it's like the most wonderfully simple thing ever. So I'll explain kind of how it works real briefly here in Laravel, and then you guys hopefully it'll make sense in Rails as well. So what you do is if you have a form, say a view form with all the reactive inputs, right? And then a user presses submit, so to submit that data to the form, down to the server. In that situation, you would still submit that using Inertia. So what you would have is you'd have a submit interceptor, right, where you prevent the default browser full page submission. And then you would say, so imagine we're on the create user page, right? And you hit create user, hit the button, the form submits, we catch it. And then in your JavaScript, in your view page component, or in your React page component or whatever, you would then say inertia.post, if we're creating a user, post. and you would say, we're going to post that to /users and pass in the data from that component. So it's just like literally a one-liner, but you don't then do a bunch of work after that. You don't say, well, give me the response back and let me inspect the response to see if there was errors. And if there's errors, I'm going to go and manually update the view and display those errors. And if there's no errors, well, then we're going to redirect to somewhere else. You don't do any of that. All you say is Inertia post to the user's page. Then what happens is there's two paths. There's a happy path, the user was created, and there's the unhappy path. There was a validation error, server-side validation error. So we'll do happy path first. You hit the user create page or the user store endpoint, so that controller endpoint to store the user. Validation all passes. It creates the user, and then server-side in that XHR inertia request, you then just do a classic redirect to wherever you would have normally gone. You would, if it was just like a regular standard full page application, you would just do a redirect to wherever you want that user to go after they created the user. So maybe you send them to the user show page at that point, right? So what you would do the same thing with Inertia. You'd literally just say, however, in Rails or in Laravel, you return a redirect to that new user's page. So then that redirect's going to happen within that XHR request. And what's going to do is it's going to go now to that show user page. And that show user page is going to load. Keep in mind, this is all happening within the initial Inertia post request. Okay, so that redirect's happening. You're now landing on the user show page, and it's just giving you a response. But it knows that it was an Inertia request because that X Inertia header actually gets forwarded on when that redirect happens. And then on the user show page, it just returns, because it knows it's an Inertia request, it just returns the JSON payload back, which includes the page component name and the page data, which would be the show user page and the user data for that page. So that all then comes back to your create user page, that form, and Inertia automatically now dynamically swaps out the create user page for the show user page and passes the component. So you don't need to do any work to redirect the user. It just automatically happens because you're redirecting server side. So that's the happy path. The unhappy path is validation fails, and it essentially works the same way. The user submits the form via post, Inertia post, that goes to the store controller endpoint. The validation fails. And the way, at least this is how it works in Laravel, when the validation fails, it automatically redirects you back to the page that you're on. So Laravel, if I go to create a user and maybe it's missing the first name, Laravel automatically does a redirect back to the user page, but then includes some flash data saying, well, there was an error and here's the error, which if you're using classic server-side templates, you would then take that error and repopulate the page with your old values and display the errors. However, with Inertia, you get an Inertia response back. So what it'll do is it'll redirect back to the create user page, and it will pass along all the data that you would have for that page anyway. So the create user page, maybe there is no data because you're creating a user, but it would say it's a create user page, and then it would have some data, which is the errors that just happened. Those errors now get passed back to Inertia, and Inertia sees that we're on the same page still. So we went to the create post page, it failed, it redirected us back to the create user page, but now we have this bucket of errors. But those errors have been provided from Inertia as props. So the page component doesn't change. So there's no swapping of the page component. So you're going to still be on the create user page, but what it now has is the errors. And all you do, and those errors come through as props. So you don't have to do any work to update as long as your page component, your client-side page component's designed that anytime your create user page component is rendering any errors that come through as a prop, it's just going to, because it's all reactive, it's just going to automatically display those errors. So like I said, this is a tough thing to explain over a podcast, but the point is, because it's all reactive, because that's the way Vue and React and Svelte work, when that response comes back and has the errors, the props come in and they automatically update. So you literally, it just ends up making for these really, really simple forms, because you don't have to do a whole bunch of wrangling to figure out what the response was and update it. It just kind of all happens magically. And because you're not doing a full page load, you're not having to repopulate all that data that you put in. So that whatever data they put into the form, it's not like you're having to repopulate that, because it's all there still, because that page component wasn't destroyed. It's still persistent there. Does that make sense?
Oh, it totally makes sense. I think it's very close to what we would have in Rails, right? I mean,
Right,
I
because
think you're
Rails does some magic with that stuff, right? Like it kind of like adds some stuff to your forms, some JavaScript stuff already, right?
well, I mean, if you have Rails, not really. So the way that it would okay, so if I just had vanilla Rails, right? I would submit my form, right? Happy path would redirect me to like a show page or an index page maybe. The failed path, I would come back, and what would probably happen is validation things that weren't there before would now suddenly be there because Rails is going to render that template, and Rails is going to conditionally now render some new things.
Yeah.
Kind of depends on maybe what gems you have installed, other things like that. But that's usually going to be what it is.
Yeah.
But
Yep,
yeah,
that makes
it's really
sense.
close. It's really close.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So awesome. I mean, yeah, I think the basic gist here that I'm understanding is that Inertia is going to make it pretty easy for me as a Rails developer to say, you know what, I have this maybe legacy application or something. Like I'm seeing a lot of use cases with already existing applications where I then want to sprinkle some Vue or some React or something on a page or two and have it be a little bit of a spa there for a little while. That's kind of what I'm seeing the major use case with Rails be. I mean, I guess you could design this with this in mind too. I don't see anything wrong with that.
Yeah, that's what most people are doing. People are upgrading like existing apps to use Inertia, but like most people are using it. It's kind of like greenfield projects at this point. But that's also because it's a pretty new project.
Yeah, excitement, things like that. Also,
Yeah.
always play into this stuff.
Yep.
Any other questions from you, Luke, before we kind of roll into picks here?
Do we want to talk about GitHub sponsorship?
Sure, why not? So in the notes that you sent us, Jonathan, you said that you had started a GitHub sponsorship campaign. You want to talk a little bit about that before we get rolling?
Yeah, sure. That's cool. Yeah, I was just trying to think of interesting things that might be fun talking about. That's kind of a bit of a newer thing. Yeah, so this, I've been doing open source for a long, long time. And it's always a challenge working on open source. Justifying spending time on it. If you're running a business and if you have a family and life's busy, it's difficult to justify committing large chunks of time to open source just strictly from a business or personal time management perspective. And so what I did with Inertia when GitHub sponsorships came out, I said, you know what, this is a project that I think has legs for the long term, and this is something I want to work on. But I've seen how much work Tailwind CSS took and what it takes to make a really, really successful project, open source project. And I thought, I want to try to monetize it in some way to help me justify spending a bit of time on this thing. So I put out the GitHub sponsorships, and it was really, I totally didn't expect much of a response, but I got over 50 sponsors, which is, not an enormous amount of money, but it's, upwards of about $1,000 a month, which was double. So it was like $2,000 a month from GitHub for a while, which was awesome. I think that's just, I didn't know what to think of the GitHub sponsorship stuff at first. I'm like, are people actually going to help contribute out of their own pockets toward open source? And obviously GitHub believed that would happen, and now it's crazy what some people are able to do with their GitHub sponsors, and there's some people working on open source full time making a lot more money than that on their GitHub sponsors, which I think honestly is a really, really cool thing for open source. It kind of just it's recognizing the amount of time and effort it takes for people to work on open source and build quality software that it's crazy how the amount of, at least for me, I've always worked in the Laravel PHP space. Like it's all free software, right? And this is what we're using to run our businesses and everything else. And to me, it only makes sense that some of that money goes back, if nothing else, to just help people spend business hours on open source and not have to feel like they're losing money or running into issues with their boss because they feel bad working on it during work hours or whatever.
Yeah, no, I think it's pretty cool too. I do not think it's the end all be all, because I think there's a limit, right? If programmers are the only people contributing to open source, like we're just not going to have enough money in open source. But I do think it's definitely a piece of the puzzle. I'm pretty pleased with it myself.
Yeah, I totally
cool.
agree with that sentiment. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad that you were able to get some people to support you. So I guess before we move into picks, if people want to get a hold of you, follow you, things like that, how do you recommend they do that?
Yeah, so I'm active on Twitter. That's kind of like the go-to place. It's just my last name, Reinink, REININK, on Twitter. And I talk about, all kinds of Inertia and database and Laravel stuff there. So if you're interested, follow me there. And then my website, Reinink, so same handle, Reinink, REININK.ca. I blog on there. And then obviously Inertia, if you Google Inertia.js, you'll find Inertia.js.com if you want to learn more about that project.
Awesome. We'll make sure that those links are in the show notes too.
Have you thought about learning to do native iOS development? Are you using Swift at work? Or maybe you've considered writing applications for macOS. We have a podcast that covers all of that called iPhreaks. We have a new panel and a lot of exciting things to talk about, so come check us out at iPhreakshow.com.
So sweet, let's go ahead and move on into picks. Luke, do you have any picks for us this week?
My word, do I have a pick for you this week? We were recently unlucky enough to lose our server developer who has been building our Kubernetes stack for us. And this means that I've been spending the whole week doing Kubernetes, non-stop Kubernetes this week. I had used it before back in 2018. But the Kubernetes is in a bit of a state of flux at the moment. So coming back to it, especially if you're kind of running on Google Kubernetes engine or something, there's been a lot of changes. So my pick for this week is a book on Kubernetes. It's by another English man, the English IT mafia coming in here, and it's called, imaginatively enough, The Kubernetes Book. It was updated in February 2020, and it's been very helpful getting up to speed with the Kubernetes.
Awesome. Any other picks for us, or is that it for us?
That's it. I'm not going to pick Kubernetes itself. Make of that what you will.
That's fair. I'd have to plug Shipplane if you did. I feel like anything to make it easier.
Do you know what? We've got time for a quick rant here. Here we go. Kubernetes, right? You're learning a Kubernetes. You think, right, I've got my book, I've got my my Docker desktop. I'm going to go into settings and tick the box. I've got a requirement for Windows, so doing all on Windows. And I say to Docker desktop, make me a Kubernetes cluster. Yes. Would you like to guess how much RAM this uses on my desktop machine? It should take a wild guess how much ticking this little box cost me.
All of it.
It's
That'll be my guess.
It's 3 gigabytes of RAM, and I haven't made any pods yet. I haven't run my app. It's just sitting there. It's eaten free. It's the first time this machine's cracked 10 gig. There's 2 sticks of RAM in this machine, and this is the first time the second one's had to wake up.
Yeah, that makes sense. The typical Kubernetes cluster is you have a box that's just running Kubernetes, right? All the other stuff comes later, right? After that box. I wonder if your little ticked box right there is just spinning up the Kubernetes sort of
if you can list, you can see all the background stuff. Yeah, it's all I found a box, you can see what it's doing. But I mean, the plus side, keep it positive. The interface, the API is quite nice. It's not perfect, but there's some things to like there. Declarative's all good, but that's been around for a while. The language of it is nice and clean. So there's some good signs.
I'm a little confused though. I thought all Rails developers used Heroku. So why are you even on Kubernetes?
Who uses Heroku? I mean, I know that there's lots of people that do. Don't get me wrong. I haven't. I've always been very DevOps like person and things like that. And so like I don't, because I don't get a lot of value out of it personally. But if you're not really into that, I can totally see that.
Just a little joke, because I know that's kind of like a big part of Heroku's background, right? A lot of Ruby Rails. Yeah. I think so. Yeah.
They came from our community, so yep. At least
great.
That's my understanding. Yeah. No, they're not bad. Just I'm not using them. Okay, I guess it's on me now. So the first thing that I'm picking today is we grew tomato plants like we do every year. So yesterday, our tomato plants have been producing for like about a month. And the average amount that I'm bringing in is a bowl full that's like about, 10 or 12 inches big and like 6 inches deep. Like we have like, I don't know, like 6 or 7 tomato plants and they go nuts. And it all is because we basically watched some YouTube videos on like how to like prune them and not like kill them and all these things. And so I'll paste them in here. So if you're like totally, there's probably more stuff out there. There's probably somebody that knows how to like take care of other kinds of plants, but I'm definitely like pushing watch some YouTube videos if you're doing like some home gardening things, especially if you're like growing stuff because it's like COVID and everybody seems to be into that this year. Maybe it's a little late for you because maybe your growing season's past, but definitely for if you keep doing it next year. So gardening videos, awesome. The other thing that I wanted to plug here. So earlier in the session, Luke was like, hey, I don't want to have to go to my logs for queries and stuff. Well, I did some some looking during.
Well, I'll tell you why. I can reveal why now, because of blasted apps in Kubernetes, and you can't get at the thing.
Okay, maybe what I should give you is a link to a tutorial on how to read logs in Kubernetes, because that I think is your actual problem then. All right, but I couldn't find a gem that did that, but I did find some pretty sweet gems that give you all sorts of extra query debugging, tracing to the exact spot in your code, explaining. So I'll just link those because they were cool anyway. So yep, those are my picks. Jonathan, did you have anything for us?
Yeah, I didn't have anything at the beginning, but kind of as you guys were talking, I've come up with 3. One of them is, as I've mentioned earlier, a project that I was involved with is called Tailwind CSS, and this is a kind of a unique approach to CSS and building applications that I would highly recommend to your audience to check out. It's become really, really popular, and it's honestly changed the way that I handle CSS. I pretty much don't write CSS anymore because I'm using Tailwind, which is, if that's confusing to you, then you should definitely check it out. And I will warn you, if you've come from like a SAS or a less background, or just plain old CSS, and you look at this approach, you will probably be disgusted at first, but it is really, really great. Give it a chance. And I pretty much guarantee you'll be making web UIs faster than you were before. And the maintenance is wonderful moving forward because it's just a lot easier to manage because it's all in HTML and not in CSS. So pick number 1, Tailwind CSS. Pick number 2 is... I mentioned earlier that I put out a database course. Now, I should mention that this course was primarily designed for Laravel developers. Well, totally designed for Laravel developers. But there is a lot of crossover between Laravel's ORM, which is called Eloquent, and Active Record in Rails. So there's some interesting techniques. So if you are a Laravel developer, listen to this, or just even a Rails developer who wants to learn some techniques about databases and how to make your database queries faster, check out my course, eloquent-course.reinink.ca, which I'm assuming will end up in the notes. Yeah, so that's my second pick. And my third one is less software related, but I live on a farm. And this week so a little bit of background, I live on a farm, so I have wireless internet, which basically means that I have an antenna on my property that points to another antenna about 2 kilometers away from this internet service provider. And this year, the tree line between us and the tower that we point to is like really growing in. The trees are really growing in, the leaves are really growing in, and our internet's getting more and more unstable. So I've been pricing out some new hardware because it turns out that if I move my antenna about 100 meters south of where my house is right now, which is out in basically the middle of a field, I have a small little 50-acre property, so we have a bit of land. So I have the flexibility to move the tower. I get perfect line of vision to this tower. But the problem is I have to then get it from there to my house and my barn as well. So I've been playing around and been researching a bunch of Ubiquity products. And if you are in the similar sort of position as me, I can't recommend this stuff enough. It's so cool. I've been playing around with a product called the Nano Beam, which are these they're small little things. They're maybe they're circular, maybe 6 or 7 inches wide, and they're rated for 15 to 20 kilometers. Like I only need it for 300 meters or something. And it just makes it really, really easy to create these wireless connections between long range wireless connections between different places on my property. So whatever, I'm just kind of nerding out on the Ubiquity products right now because
I'll give you a +1 for that.
Yeah, you've worked with them before?
Yeah, so a job that I had over a decade ago, one of the things that we did is we broadcast auctions, and a lot of the barns that these auctions would be done in, they didn't have good internet connections, and so we were using wireless equipment all the time, and we swore by Ubiquity. So just saying, that was 10 years ago, but as far as I know, good stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. I actually have one already set up on my property between 2 spots, and we actually had a buried wire under the ground, and it gave us all kinds of trouble. And then we put in a couple nano beams, and it's just it's almost like they are wired because that's what it looks like from a network perspective. And they just work flawlessly. So that's my picks.
Awesome. All righty. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you again another time.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.